rain fell in thin, reluctant sheets that Thursday morning, painting the sidewalks dark and slick. Daniel Crawford pulled his jacket tighter and glanced back at his 2 children trailing behind him, their backpacks bouncing with each hurried step. Jake, his 7-year-old son, was complaining about a math test. Emma, just 5, clutched her father's hand and yawned. They were late again. The bus would arrive in 3 minutes, maybe less. The bus stop sat at the corner where Maple Street met the main road, sheltered by a rusted metal awning that did little against the weather. As they approached, Daniel noticed a small figure hunched on the bench, a girl he had never seen before. She wore a thin cotton sweater, no jacket, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself. Her hair hung in damp tangles across her face. Something about the way she sat, so still and withdrawn, made Daniel slow his pace. "Dad, come on," Jake urged, tugging at his sleeve. But Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the girl. She could not have been older than 8 or 9. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and even from several feet away, he could see the dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked like she had not slept in days, or eaten much either. Daniel told himself it was not his business. Maybe her parents were running late. Maybe she was waiting for someone. He took another step forward, ready to move past her. That was when she collapsed. It happened so quickly that for a moment, Daniel thought he had imagined it. 1 second she was sitting upright. The next, she was sliding sideways off the bench, her body crumpling onto the wet concrete like a discarded doll. Emma gasped. Jake froze, and Daniel was already running. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly before he gently turned her onto her back. Her face was pale, her lips faintly blue. Her breathing was shallow, barely perceptible. Panic clawed at his chest. "Emma, Jake, stay back," he ordered, his voice sharper than he intended. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. His mind raced through possibilities. Seizure, dehydration, hypothermia. The dispatcher's voice was calm and methodical. Asking questions he struggled to answer. How old was she? He did not know. Did she have any medical conditions? He did not know. Was she alone? It seemed so. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Daniel cradled the girl's small, cold hand in his, whispering reassurances he was not sure she could hear. Jake stood behind him, wide-eyed and silent. Emma had started to cry, though she was trying to be brave. The ambulance arrived, and paramedics rushed forward, their movements efficient and practiced. They lifted the girl onto a stretcher, checking her vitals, inserting an IV line. Daniel watched, feeling helpless and strangely responsible. "Are you her father?" one of the paramedics asked. "No, I just found her here." She was alone. The paramedic frowned, exchanging a glance with his partner. "We'll take her to St. Michael's. If you have any information, it would help." Daniel had no information, but he could not shake the image of her collapsing, the way her body had seemed to give up. He looked down at Jake and Emma, their faces full of confusion and concern. He should have been getting them to school. He should have been heading to work. But something inside him refused to walk away. "I'll follow you to the hospital," he heard himself say. The paramedic nodded, and the ambulance doors closed. Daniel took his children's hands and led them back to his car, the rain still falling, softer now but steady. Neither Jake nor Emma asked questions. They seemed to understand that something important had just happened. Something that had shifted the morning from ordinary to urgent. Daniel started the engine and pulled onto the road, following the red and white lights ahead. He did not know the girl's name. He did not know where she came from or why she had been sitting alone at a bus stop in the rain. But he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that her life and his had just become tangled together in a way he could not yet comprehend. The weight of that knowledge pressed against his chest as he drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his children silent in the back seat, and the rain continuing its quiet, relentless fall. St. Michael's Hospital rose ahead of them, a gray building with too many windows, and Daniel pulled into the emergency lot, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He unbuckled his seatbelt and looked back at Jake and Emma. "We're going to make sure she's okay," he said quietly. "Then I'll take you to school." Emma nodded, her small hand reaching for his. Jake's expression was serious, older than his years. "Is she going to be all right, Dad?" he asked. Daniel wished he knew the answer. Inside the emergency room, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a stark, clinical glow. A nurse at the front desk looked up as they approached, her expression neutral and efficient. Daniel explained what had happened, his words tumbling out faster than he intended. The nurse listened, tapped something into her computer, and told him to wait. So he waited, with Jake and Emma on either side of him, their legs swinging above the floor, their eyes watching the hallway where doctors and nurses moved with purposeful urgency. 20 minutes passed, then 40. Daniel called his boss, explained the situation, asked for the morning off. His boss was not pleased, but Daniel did not care. He sent a text to Jake and Emma's school, letting them know the kids would be late. He bought them snacks from the vending machine, stale crackers and juice boxes, and they ate in silence. Finally, a doctor emerged, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She scanned the waiting area and approached Daniel. "You're the one who brought in the girl from the bus stop?" "Yes." "Is she okay?" The doctor's expression softened, but there was something heavy in her eyes. "She's stable. We've got her on fluids, and she's warming up. But I need to talk to you about her condition." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "What's wrong?" The doctor glanced at Jake and Emma, then back at Daniel. "Is there somewhere private we can speak?" Daniel hesitated, then asked the nurse at the desk if his kids could wait in the family room. She nodded kindly and led them to a small space with toys and books. Once they were settled, Daniel followed the doctor down the hallway to a quiet consultation room. She closed the door and gestured for him to sit. He did, his hands gripping the armrests. "The girl is severely malnourished," the doctor began. "She shows signs of prolonged neglect, dehydration, low body weight, vitamin deficiencies. Her clothes are old and ill-fitting, and she has bruises on her arms and legs, some older than others." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. "Abuse? We've reported it to Child Protective Services. They're sending someone over. But here's the thing. She's been asking for someone named Daniel." He blinked. "What?" "When she woke up, she kept saying your name. Or at least, we think she was saying your name. She's disoriented, frightened. She won't tell us who her parents are or where she lives. She just keeps repeating that Daniel will come." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "I've never seen her before today. I don't know who she is." The doctor studied him carefully. "Sometimes children latch onto the first person who shows them kindness in a crisis. You saved her. In her mind, you might represent safety." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spinning. "What happens to her now?" "CPS will take custody. They'll try to locate her family, but if no one comes forward, she'll be placed in emergency foster care." "And if no one comes forward?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then she becomes a ward of the state. She'll be moved to a group home or a foster family, depending on availability." Daniel thought of the girl, small and fragile and alone. He thought of the way she had collapsed, as if the world had finally become too heavy to bear. He thought of Jake and Emma, and how they had watched with such wide, worried eyes. "Can I see her?" he asked. The doctor nodded. "Follow me." They walked through the maze of hallways until they reached a room near the end. The doctor pushed open the door, and Daniel stepped inside. The girl lay in a hospital bed, an IV taped to her arm. Her face still pale but no longer that awful gray. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. When she saw Daniel, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition or relief. "Hey," he said softly, moving closer. "I'm Daniel. I'm the one who found you at the bus stop. How are you feeling?" The girl did not answer. She just looked at him with eyes far too old for her age, eyes that had seen too much. "Do you remember what happened?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Can you tell me your name?" A long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Sophie." "Sophie," Daniel repeated. "That's a nice name. Do you know where your parents are, Sophie?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. He wanted to ask more, to understand, but he could see that she was not ready, so he simply pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I just wanted to make sure you're all right." Sophie's hand, small and pale, crept out from under the blanket. She did not reach for him, but she did not pull away either. Daniel stayed with her until the doctor returned with a social worker, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who carried a clipboard and wore a kind but tired expression. "Mr. Crawford, I'm going to need to ask you some questions," Mrs. Patterson said. Daniel nodded and followed her out into the hallway. Mrs. Patterson explained that Sophie had no identification, no records in the system, and no one had reported her missing. They would continue to investigate, but for now, Sophie would need to be placed in temporary care. "What about family?" Daniel asked. "Doesn't she have anyone?" "We're looking into it, but these cases can take time." Daniel glanced back at the room where Sophie lay, her small form almost swallowed by the hospital bed. He thought of Jake and Emma waiting for him in the family room. He thought of his own life, already stretched thin, his job barely paying the bills, his apartment small and cramped. He had no business getting involved. He had no room in his life for another child, especially one with so much trauma. But as he stood there in the sterile hospital hallway, he could not shake the feeling that walking away would be the worst mistake he had ever made. "If no one claims her," Daniel said slowly, "what are her options?" Mrs. Patterson looked at him carefully. "Emergency foster care, like I said, or a group home if no foster family is available right away. And if someone wanted to take her in." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Are you considering that, Mr. Crawford?" Daniel hesitated. The responsible answer was no. The logical answer was no. But he found himself saying, "I don't know. Maybe." Mrs. Patterson handed him a card. "If you're serious, call this number. We'll need to do a background check, a home assessment, interviews. It's not a simple process." Daniel took the card, feeling the weight of it in his hand. "I understand." He returned to the family room where Jake and Emma were drawing on scrap paper with crayons the nurse had given them. They looked up as he entered, their faces full of questions. "Is she okay?" Emma asked. "She's going to be," Daniel said. "Her name is Sophie." Jake frowned. "Where are her parents?" Daniel crouched down to their level. "We don't know yet. But she's safe now. The hospital is taking care of her." "Is she going to be alone?" Emma's voice was small, worried. Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart." Emma looked at him with those big, earnest eyes. "That's sad." "Yeah," Daniel agreed. "It is." They left the hospital an hour later, after Daniel had checked on Sophie one more time. She was asleep, her breathing steady, her face relaxed. He drove Jake and Emma to school, late but safe, and then he drove to work, where he spent the rest of the day distracted and restless. His mind kept circling back to Sophie, to the way she had said his name, to the bruises on her arms, and the emptiness in her eyes. That night, after he had fed his kids and helped with homework and tucked them into bed, Daniel sat at his small kitchen table with Mrs. Patterson's card in front of him. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about his own childhood, about the father who had left when Daniel was 10, about the years of instability and uncertainty. He thought about how he had sworn he would be different, that he would be there for his children, no matter what. But Jake and Emma were not the only children in the world who needed someone to be there. Daniel picked up his phone and dialed the number on the card. Mrs. Patterson answered on the third ring. This is Patricia Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, it's Daniel Crawford. We spoke at the hospital today. About Sophie. Yes, Mr. Crawford. Have you made a decision? Daniel took a deep breath. I want to help her. I don't know if I can, but I want to try. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Mrs. Patterson said, Come by my office tomorrow at 9. We'll talk about next steps. Thank you, Daniel said. He hung up and sat in the silence of his kitchen, the weight of what he had just done settling over him. He had no idea what he was getting into. He had no idea if he could handle it. But he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and comforted him, that he had made the right choice. The next morning, Daniel dropped Jake and Emma at school and drove to the Child Protective Services office downtown. Mrs. Patterson met him in a small, cluttered room filled with filing cabinets and motivational posters. She had a file on her desk, thin but growing. Sophie is still in the hospital, she began. We've been trying to locate her family, but so far, nothing. No missing persons report, no match in our database. It's like she doesn't exist on paper. How is that possible? Daniel asked. It happens more often than you'd think. Children who slip through the cracks, families who avoid the system. We're still investigating. She leaned forward. Now, about your interest in fostering Sophie. I need to be clear, this is a serious commitment. Fostering is difficult under the best circumstances. With a child who has experienced trauma, it can be overwhelming. I understand. Do you have experience with children who have been abused or neglected? No. But I have 2 kids of my own. I've raised them alone since their mother left 3 years ago. I know it's not the same, but I know what it means to be responsible for someone. Mrs. Patterson made notes on her pad. Tell me about your living situation. I have a 2-bedroom apartment. Jake and Emma share 1 room. I have the other. It's small, but it's clean and safe. And your income? I work at a warehouse. It's not much, but we get by. Mrs. Patterson looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Crawford, I'm going to be honest with you. Your financial situation is going to be a concern. Foster parents receive a stipend, but it's not always enough. And if you're already stretched thin, with 2 children, I know, Daniel interrupted. I know it's not ideal, but I can't stop thinking about her. I can't stop thinking about what happens if no one steps up. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. That's admirable, but admiration doesn't pay the bills or heal trauma. Sophie is going to need therapy, medical care, patience. Are you prepared for that? Daniel met her gaze. I don't know if I'm prepared, but I'm willing. Mrs. Patterson sighed. All right. We'll start the process. Background check, home visit, references. It'll take a few weeks, maybe longer. In the meantime, Sophie will remain in the hospital until she's medically cleared. Then she'll be placed in temporary foster care. Can I visit her? Yes. In fact, I think it would be good for her to see a familiar face. Daniel left the office with a mix of relief and anxiety. He had set something in motion that could not be undone. Over the next few days, he visited Sophie every evening after work. At first, she barely spoke, just watched him with those wary, haunted eyes. But slowly, incrementally, she began to open up. She told him small things. Her favorite color was purple. She liked drawing. She was afraid of the dark. Jake and Emma came with him one evening, curious and cautious. Sophie stared at them as if they were creatures from another world. Emma, bold as always, climbed onto the bed and handed Sophie a drawing she had made at school. I made this for you, Emma said. It's a rainbow. Sophie took the paper carefully, as if it might break. Thank you, she whispered. Jake stood by the door, uncertain. Do you like puzzles? He asked after a moment. Sophie nodded. Maybe we can do one together sometime, Jake offered. Something shifted in Sophie's face, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around herself. 2 weeks later, Sophie was discharged from the hospital. Mrs. Patterson arranged for her to stay with a temporary foster family, while Daniel's home study was completed. It was not ideal, but it was better than a group home. Daniel visited whenever he could, bringing books and games, trying to make her feel less alone. The home visit came on a rainy Saturday. Mrs. Patterson arrived with another social worker, and they walked through Daniel's apartment, making notes, asking questions. They checked the smoke detectors, the locks on the windows, the food in the pantry. They interviewed Jake and Emma, asking how they felt about potentially having another sibling. "I think it would be nice," Emma said. "Sophie is sad. Maybe we can make her happy." Jake was more reserved. "It would be different, but Dad says we should help people when we can." Mrs. Patterson smiled at that. A week later, Daniel got the call. He had been approved as a temporary foster parent for Sophie. The placement would be a trial period, and there would be regular check-ins, but if all went well, he could pursue permanent custody. Daniel felt his hands shake as he hung up the phone. He told Jake and Emma that night at dinner, and they reacted with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "So she's going to live with us?" Jake asked. "Yes. Starting next week." "Where will she sleep?" Emma wanted to know. Daniel had already thought about that. "I'll take the couch. Sophie can have my room." "But that's not fair to you," Jake protested. "It's temporary," Daniel assured him. "We'll figure it out." The day Sophie moved in was bright and unseasonably warm. Daniel picked her up from the temporary foster home, and she sat in the back seat of his car with a small duffel bag containing everything she owned. She did not say much on the drive, just stared out the window as the city rolled past. When they arrived at the apartment, Jake and Emma were waiting by the door, bouncing with nervous energy. Daniel carried Sophie's bag inside, and she followed slowly, her eyes taking in the cramped but cozy space. "This is home," Daniel said, trying to sound confident. "Your room is this way." He led her to his bedroom, which he had cleaned and rearranged. He had bought new sheets, hung up some curtains, and put a small lamp on the nightstand. It was not much, but it was the best he could offer. Sophie stood in the doorway, looking at the room as if she could not quite believe it was real. "Is this really mine?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," Daniel said. "It's really yours." For the first time since he had met her, Sophie smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. Over the next few weeks, the household adjusted to its new rhythm. It was not easy. Sophie woke up screaming from nightmares. She flinched at loud noises. She hoarded food under her bed, terrified that it would run out. Daniel did his best to reassure her, to create routines and consistency. Jake and Emma tried to include her, to make her feel like part of the family, though it was clear Sophie did not yet know how to be part of anything. Then, one evening, Mrs. Patterson called with news. They had found Sophie's mother. Daniel's heart sank. "Is she coming for her?" "No," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Her mother passed away 2 years ago. Overdose. Sophie's father is the one who's been on record as her guardian, but he hasn't been seen in over a year. We tracked him down to a motel in Nevada. He's been arrested on drug charges. He's not coming back." Daniel closed his eyes, grief and relief warring inside him. "So what happens now?" "We'll begin proceedings to terminate his parental rights. After that, Sophie will be legally free for adoption. If you're still interested, Mr. Crawford, you'll have the opportunity to adopt her." Daniel felt the weight of it, the enormity. Adoption was not fostering. Adoption was forever. "I need to think about it," he said. "Of course, take your time." But as Daniel hung up the phone and looked over at Sophie, who was sitting on the floor with Emma, carefully coloring inside the lines of a coloring book, he realized there was nothing to think about. The decision had already been made, somewhere deep inside him. The moment he had knelt beside her on that wet concrete and held her hand, he wanted to give her a home, not just a place to stay, but a real home, a family. That night, after the kids were asleep, Daniel lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his own father, the one who had walked out, and never looked back. He thought about the man he had become, the choices he had made, the life he had built. It was not a perfect life. It was messy and complicated and hard, but it was full of love, and that had to count for something. The next morning, Daniel called Mrs. Patterson and told her he wanted to move forward with adoption. The process was long and exhausting. There were court hearings, more home visits, interviews with psychologists and lawyers. Sophie had to be evaluated, her trauma assessed. Daniel had to prove he could provide for her, not just financially, but emotionally. There were moments when he doubted himself, when he wondered if he was being selfish, if he was taking on more than he could handle. But every time doubt crept in, he would see Sophie laugh at one of Jake's jokes, or watch her curl up next to Emma during movie night, or hear her call him by name without that edge of fear in her voice. And he would remember why he was doing this. The final hearing took place on a cold morning in November. The courtroom was small and formal. The judge, an older man with a stern face and kind eyes. Daniel sat at a table with his lawyer, his hands clenched in his lap. Sophie sat beside him, wearing a dress Mrs. Patterson had bought for the occasion. Jake and Emma sat in the gallery with a neighbor who had agreed to watch them. The judge reviewed the case, asked questions, listened to testimony from social workers and therapists. He asked Sophie if she understood what adoption meant. Sophie nodded. "It means I get to stay. And is that what you want?" the judge asked. "Yes," Sophie said, her voice small but firm. "I want to stay with Daniel. And Jake. And Emma." The judge looked at Daniel. "Mr. Crawford, do you understand the responsibilities you're taking on?" "Yes, Your Honor. And you're prepared to care for this child, to provide for her needs, to be her father in every sense of the word." Daniel felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. He thought about the mornings when he could barely afford groceries, the nights when he lay awake worrying about bills. He thought about the times he had failed, the times he had felt inadequate. But he also thought about Sophie, about the way she had started to heal, the way she had started to trust. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I'm prepared." The judge was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, just a little. "Then I see no reason to delay. The adoption is granted. Sophie is now legally your daughter." The courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes. Jake and Emma jumped up from their seats, grinning. And Sophie turned to Daniel, her eyes wide and bright. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," Daniel said, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, and Daniel felt her small body shaking with sobs, the kind that come from deep inside, from a place where pain and relief and hope all tangle together. He held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair, and he thought about the morning he had found her at the bus stop, cold and broken and alone. He thought about how easily he could have walked past her, how close he had come to doing just that, but he had not walked past. He had stopped. He had reached out. And in doing so, he had changed both their lives forever. Outside the courthouse, the November sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the pavement. Jake and Emma ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the buildings. Sophie walked between Daniel and Mrs. Patterson, her hand in Daniel's, her face turned up toward the light. "Thank you," Sophie said softly. Daniel looked down at her. "For what?" "For not leaving me." He squeezed her hand. "I never could have." Mrs. Patterson said her goodbyes, promising to check in but confident that this family would be just fine. As she drove away, Daniel stood on the sidewalk with his 3 children, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the weight of Sophie's hand in his. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be hard days, setbacks, struggles. But there would also be laughter and love and moments of unexpected grace. A family was not just something you were born into. It was something you built, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. And as Daniel led his children toward home, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as a family bound by something far stronger. The decision to love, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when the world said it was impossible. Sophie looked up at him and smiled, and in that smile, Daniel saw the future. He saw graduations and birthdays, scraped knees and late-night talks, the ordinary and the extraordinary woven together into the fabric of a life. He saw a girl who had been lost finding her way home, and he saw himself, a single father who had been just trying to survive, learning what it meant to truly live. They walked together down the sidewalk, the sun warm on their backs, the city alive around them, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Not the fragile, fleeting kind, but the deep, unshakable kind that comes from knowing you have done the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. The kind that comes from love